And by the time the pulses reached the Earth, it increased the temperature in the atmosphere by 4 degrees centigrade in 35 years. But your point is this all occurred, the global warming occurred, before the Industrial Revolution, before man emitted so much as a molecule of carbon dioxide outside of his normal breathing.
That's quite right. It was 4 degrees Fahrenheit in 35 years. We must not over-egg the pudding in the way that Al Gore does. But yeah.
Okay.
Still a very big increase in a very short time, given that in the whole of the 20th century, in the back end of which we might, in theory, have had some influence, global temperatures rose in the whole of that century by only 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. And so what we're looking at is 300 years of global warming between the end of the grand minimum, when the sun was at its most inactive in 10,000 years, and the end of the grand maximum, which more or less coincided with the end of the 20th century, when the sun had risen from its grand minimum up to a grand maximum when it was at its most active in 11,400 years. The biggest increase in solar activity that we're able to infer happened over the last 10,000 years has happened just in these last 300 years. Naturally, we've had 300 years of global warming, and it is precisely because of that fact that most solar physicists attribute the warming that we have seen in the 20th century and in the 19th century and in the 18th century to the sun, because until the last 30 or 40 years of the 20th century, we were not emitting enough CO2 or other greenhouse gases to make any significant difference to the temperature at all on any theory. It just couldn't have been. And that's why, for instance, Cafetta and West, I was talking about just before the break, the authors of a scientific paper published last year, attributed at least two-thirds of the warming of the 20th century to the sun. And there have been many other papers saying that. The Symposium of the International Astronomical Union said the same back in 2004. It said, expect global cooling to come. Then along comes Al Gore with his sci-fi comedy horror movie issued in January 2005 talking about global warming. Do you know what's happened since then? Who was right? Was it the International Astronomical Union? Was it the scientists? Or was it Al Gore? It was the scientists. Since then, we've had 4 years of global cooling at a rate so rapid that if it carried on at the rate we've seen in the last 4 years, we would be in an ice age by 2050. So
I wanted to reiterate it. I've said several times on the show, I'm formally trained in botany, and I was an ethnobotanist for many years, traveling the South Pacific collecting medicinal plants. And I had to laugh at the absurdity, the notion of a slight increase of carbon dioxide being so damaging, when in fact the exact opposite is true. It was because of the carbon dioxide that permitted plant life to proliferate on the earth and gave man all of this wonderful food that we've been enjoying for these hundreds of years, and that if, God forbid, we saw a decrease in carbon dioxide that was catastrophic and we moved into this global cooling, there'd be massive starvation, wouldn't there?
Well, there would indeed, because, of course, cooling is far, far worse and kills far, far more people than a little bit of warming would. Warming is basically not going to kill anyone much, but cooling is very dangerous because, in fact, you're quite right. I mean, as a botanist, you'll know this well, particularly as medical botany is what floats your boat. I mean, the point here is that CO2 is absolutely essential to all plant life.
I know we should generate a little more carbon dioxide, but, let's talk about facts. I'm also an avid boater, and I've looked at tide charts going back a very long period of time here in San Francisco Bay. I have not seen a millimeter of change in the sea level. Is there any evidence of a rising sea level along the lines of Al Gore's catastrophic theories that New York City will soon be underwater?
No, all of that is rubbish. He said it again today. He said, look, it's going to rise 20 feet. But that's when the judge brought him up short and said, no, the Armageddon scenario that he depicts is not based on any scientific view. Sea level, as best we can make it out, and I got this from the world's greatest expert on this, Professor Niklas Mörner, who's been researching this for 35 years. He does nothing but sea level. He's written 520 scientific papers on the subject. And he says that in the last century, the 20th century, sea level rose by, get this, not 8 feet, not 4 feet, not 2 feet, not 1 foot, but 8 inches, maybe. Not even as much as that, probably.
Wait, 8 inches over the last 100 years?
Yep, over 100 years. It went up by just 8 inches, not 8 inches a year.
Well, wait a minute. So Gore may have something here. If we live 1,000 more years, all of us, we may see a rise of 2 feet.
The very worst that could happen, according to the UN's climate panel, and these people are basically bedwetters trying to justify their own existence, so they'll kind of sex it up as best they can, but they can't make out a maximum of more than 2 feet in the whole of the 21st century. But what's actually happening is that sea level has stopped rising altogether. Al Gore didn't mention that today, and you won't have heard that in your newspaper or on your CNN or on your MSNBC. They will somehow not have bothered to tell you that in the last 3 years there has been no statistically significant rise in sea level at all. It has stopped.
Lord Monckton, let's talk about the politics of this, because you've raised a very important point, and it goes to the heart of this. You were banned by Stalinist Democrats from even speaking and presenting your facts, which is very worrisome. But why is it that extreme leftists embrace global warming while the entire conservative intelligentsia understands it as a big lie? Why has this broken down along political lines? And moreover, the second part of the question is, in the UK at least, where I think there's a chance for a little more open-mindedness, I could be mistaken, are there any liberal so-called or labor scientists who agree with you?
There are very few on the political left who are willing to say that they agree. There are many who, of course, know perfectly well that the science behind this is, to use a technical term, bollocks. Am I allowed to say that on the air? Well, too late. I've said it now.
Oh, yes. They don't know what it means here in America, so it's perfectly
I'd probably
safe.
get away with that one there.
No, the FCC is filled with so many dummies, they wouldn't even know where to look to find what the word means.
They can look it up under cojones then.
They can look it up. It's next to coprolites, I think.
Something like that. Anyway, it's basically rubbish, and most scientists know that it's rubbish. Very few scientists dare to say that it's rubbish, because the left is ruthlessly in control of the academic world and the universities. And anyone who dares to say, just a moment, none of this adds up, it's all nonsense, they get penalized, they get moved to ever smaller offices with no daylight.
Oh, my God, it's right out of the ex-Soviet Union.
It's just like that. I can tell you of a colleague of mine who is working at one of your most eminent institutions. I won't name it, or him. It would be unkind to them both. But he has been moved successively in the last 5 years to ever smaller offices. They've been trying to get rid of him, but they can't because he is independently funded. And also because I've written to them and saying if they do remove him, I will go public and say who they are and who he is.
Unbelievable.
And this is happening all over America.
So the evidence against global warming is, one, temperatures are actually decreasing, not increasing. The level of sea level rise has actually stopped completely. What is the other evidence, sir?
Slowly. Likewise, the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere is only half what these wretched Xbox 360s and PlayStations that these scientists use predict it will be. You know, they have these so-called computer models on which the entire case for this climate alarm is built. And the computer models say there ought to be twice as much CO2 staying in the atmosphere as there is. But it's all being taken out. And you know, as a botanist, it's being taken out by trees and plants. It's being taken out to form the shells of ocean creatures. It's being taken out in huge quantities by what we call the biosphere and the hydrosphere. And that's why it isn't accumulating at the rate that the UN would like it to be accumulating, so as to justify the continued existence of its climate panel as the new world government. But the fact is that CO2 is rising at far less, about half, the rate the UN predicts, and the UN admits that it can't explain why the CO2 isn't rising as fast as it wants it to rise. So,
you know, it's interesting. I had the president of Czechoslovakia on the show 2 years ago, totally on board with the realities of the situation. You're an eminent scientist. You know what's going on. Thousands of reputable scientists say that Al Gore is a liar, and yet the American newspapers and media continue to pump out the big lie. And of course, this is tied into the emerging New World Order, one world government, where they have us all in the grips of a panic.